Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you, our friends from all around the world that are joining us in South Africa. A special welcome to our dear Holocaust survivors, to our colleagues from all around the world, to educators, to friends, to our guest speakers, Kate Melchior and our own Matthias Igler, and to all of you, friends of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. My name is Tali. I am the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. Thank you to all of you that joined us for the full series on women's agency during Nazism. I see many of you that came every week. The series included discussions on women's agency also during apartheid, also in Africa and beyond. And it is all available on the three centers' YouTube channels. So feel free to go and watch those that you missed if you did, and also share those with friends. Because we had amazing insights into different aspects of women's agency. This fantastic six-part series ending today that started on the 20th of July coincided with Women's Month in South Africa that is actually ending today. The series would not have been possible without the support and partnership of the Austrian embassy in Pretoria, and especially the ambassador, a friend of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, His Excellency Dr. Johann Brigger. Other supporters and partners I would like to thank again are the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, Mindleaps, Verin Kunstplatz in Vienna, and Amandla.mobi, Johannesburg. Finally, grateful thanks goes to the teams of the three centers in South Africa, the Holocaust and Genocide Centers of Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg. Together, this association is called the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. And we are especially grateful to the Austrian Service Abroad Cape Town intern, Aria Ascari, for all your dedication and passion that really made this series a reality. So really thank you for all your efforts. As the series is ending today, let us have a glimpse to all we learned. We had 6 different and diverse events. We learned so much about the period of National Socialism. And as I said, we made connections to Africa and to South Africa. We started exploring women's narratives of resistance and rescue in the Holocaust, but also during the genocide in Rwanda. And that was an amazing beginning. We continued in the theme of resistance in our second event, Women in Resistance, Reflections on Nazi Europe and Apartheid South Africa. And we were so moved by Justice Albie Sachs' stories of the art of Judith Mason in our own Constitutional Court. We also learned of the amazing bravery of the Steinmetz sisters during National Socialism through the exhibition and stories of Sonia Frank and Uli Makomatsky. Then we moved to the unknown story of Hedy Lamarr, the famous actress and inventor, and we explored with the historian the exhibition curated by Daniela Spera, and also learned about a play about Hedy Lamarr by Heather Massey. The arts continued to feature, and this time through dance. And our fourth event, Stories of Peace and Resistance Through Dance, had the amazing stories of Hannah Berger, the famous dancer choreographer. And we had Eva Maria Schaller sharing some of the memorable dances and stories as well. And Rebecca Davis, founder and director of Mindleaps, took us all the way to Rwanda and to Mauritania, and we looked at how dance can heal post-genocide societies. Last week, we looked at post-Holocaust and apartheid memories, confronting traumatic past of those periods, looking at both women in South Africa and Mauritius with Ronnie Mikel Arieli, looking at films in Israeli cinema portraying women with Liat Shteyr-Livni, and then finally Maria Pon Laugas talked to us about women bystanders and perpetrators in Austria and society's view of them as victims. So tonight, it is really thrilling to have our final offering. And this time, I'm not sure that it is about women. We're just going to look at Holocaust and how it is remembered in Austria. And the tour will be a virtual tour of Vienna with Kate Melchior and with Matthias Igler. So I will ask you now to keep your Zoom on mute. I'm going to introduce Kate and Matthias, and they will go through their virtual tour experiences. And then please write your questions, comments, personal stories in the chat, and we are going to look at it after Matthias finished his presentation. So who is Kate Melchior and Matthias Igler? Kate is Assistant Director of Education at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. She received her master's degree in history from the University of Bristol, but also a bachelor's in English from Northwestern University and a bachelor's in music and vocal performance, also from the same university. She was in Austria in 2012 for a Fulbright program, and she researched public memorials in Austria and especially in Vienna, and will share with us some of her findings and research. She also previously worked at Boston's Old North Church and historical sites and the Heritage Museum and Gardens in Sandwich, Massachusetts. So we are really looking very much forward to learn from all your experiences, Kate. Matthias Igler will follow after Kate, and he will speak about his hometown, Vienna. Matthias was born in Vienna. He is the Austrian service abroad intern or Gedenkdiener at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. He started his internship in January of 2021 and end his internship with us in the end of October. And we are delighted that he can share with you some of his hometown memories. Kate, the Zoom microphone is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you and honored really to have the chance to speak with all of you here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. I've already seen some people dropping comments into the chat talking about how this sort of topic is tied to their own family history, and I really look forward to having you here as part of this conversation. So a little bit about me. Thank you much again, Tali, for the introduction. I was honored to get the opportunity to research with a Fulbright scholarship for several years in Vienna, as well as to teach in Vienna. And my particular focus was looking at the history of monuments and memorials to the Holocaust. I was interested in a number of questions, but really what roles do monuments and memorials play in our communities? Who are their audiences? Which identities are prioritized and which are silenced and erased? And I found that through my research in Austria and looking at these memorials of the Holocaust through time and how they transformed as our communities transformed, not only did they better help me to understand the projection of memory and the way that people speak and understand the Holocaust and themselves, but I've also found, as an American speaking from Boston, that they helped to understand other progress of memory when dealing with difficult pasts. So I hope that whether you live in Vienna specifically or in Austria or are interested in thinking about memory in much broader contexts, that this conversation is inspiring to you in thinking about the questions of what do we put up in public spaces. So without further ado, I would like to start by sharing my screen so we can look at some photographs. So a bit of background in how I have structured this particular talk. Actually, I will wait and get there into them. Today we'll be doing a few things. I'm going to start by giving a brief background of Austria's involvement in World War II and the Holocaust. And then instead of taking us on a walking tour as one might go on foot throughout the city, my plan is actually to walk us through the stages of memory during the 20th century through time, so that we can talk about the progress of memory and track some of these shifts and patterns in memorial practice in Vienna. And then last but not least, as we go, we'll be exploring several case studies of key monuments throughout time and how those monuments engage with memory of the Holocaust in their time period. To begin, I actually want to start not at the beginning, but in the end of my time in Vienna. In 2013, Austria commemorated the 75th anniversary of its annexation into Nazi Germany. This is a photograph that I took of President Heinz Fischer at the memorial ceremony at one of the Holocaust memorials, which we will be viewing later, the Mahnmal gegen Krieg und Faschismus. And as he was addressing his nation's duty to continue looking into its national social history, Heinz Fischer said, "The wish for Austria was to leave this disaster behind and to tackle the country's future on a fresh basis. I can understand that, but only wounds that are cleaned can heal without risk of infection. And the cleaning of this wound was a long time coming." This coming from the president of Austria is an enormous departure from the memory of the Holocaust only 10 years earlier. For quite a long time, Austria clung to something called the victim thesis. As the first country to be annexed by the Third Reich, it plays a unique role in post-war national mythology and in the legal nation building of the Second Republic of Austria. However, in the last several decades, Austria has transitioned from a nation with little to no public Holocaust commemoration to one with hundreds of memorial projects. And in fact, when I was in Vienna in 2013, there had been a study recently done showing that in the last 25 years only, there had been something along the lines of 270 memorial projects that had taken place in the city. So what I'll be doing is starting us off now by going back to the beginning. So that's a bit of a lie. Before I do that, I want to show a space which comes up quite a bit in Holocaust memory and in just memory in Vienna. Anyone who has visited Austria and visited Vienna specifically has probably walked through Heldenplatz. Heldenplatz is a magnificent space. It's called Heroes Square, and it's a section of the Austrian Winter Palace, the center palace in the middle of the city. This particular space is a site of many layers of memory. It was built in stages during the 1800s. The different monuments in this space remember heroism in the Napoleonic Wars and other subsequent battles. There are also memorials to soldiers in later years, including the tomb to soldiers for those who have fought in World War I and World War II. However, those who are familiar with Austrian history may be more familiar with the way it looks in this image. This is a photograph of Heldenplatz during the Anschluss, or the annexation, in 1938. And I'm actually going to turn this photo to another one where it shows the audience. We're not looking at the plaza itself, we're looking out at the number of people. There are probably about 200,000 people in the square. So the Anschluss is really what you may think of as the beginning of, at the very least, National Socialism, specifically in Austria, or the German National Socialist regime, but also the beginning of when we're talking about Holocaust history and memory. Although the Anschluss, or the annexation, can technically be classified as a belligerent seizure by force, this was technically an invasion by Germany into Austria. The historical construction of this as purely an invasion doesn't quite do justice to the reality of the Austrian situation. This particular invasion is preceded by years of political lobbying for pan-German unification. And in fact, while not, and I want to emphasize this, not universally celebrated, there was in fact much of the local, I want to say quote unquote, Aryan designated population celebrated Germany's entry and Germany's annexation of Austria. In fact, this particular operation was nicknamed the Blumenkrieg, or the War of the Flowers, for the cheerful greeting that some members of the German army received at the border. And at this point, now these photos have become rather ubiquitous. They show the end of Hitler's march into Austria, the culmination of that parade in Heldenplatz, and the greeting with over 200,000 people here in the square. To give a bit more context about Austria and its role in World War II and in the Holocaust, I want to talk a bit about some statistics. And I would like to credit historian Evan Buki, who his work has pulled together quite a number of these details. While the German occupation was not universally welcomed, research has demonstrated how pervasive pro-Nazi sentiment was at all levels of society. And this is from political elites to the farming populace. So we can look a little bit at some of the statistics that we're looking at here. Austria constituted about 8% of the population of the German Reich as its peak, also constituted equivalently about 8% of the Wehrmacht soldiers, who are the general army. However, when we look at some of the specialists and those involved in the Holocaust in particular, statistics show that Austrians made up about 14% of the SS and about 40% of those who were working at the killing operations, including the euthanasia programs and extermination camps. So when we're talking about participation, this sort of assessment has to play a role in how we talk about Austria and its role in the Third Reich. The other ones that I want to talk about as well are Austrians who are targets of National Socialist violence. Before the war, there were something like 200,000 Jews living in Austria. Afterwards, about 5,500 remained in the country, and over 65,000 Austrian Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. We should also talk about the genocide of the Roma and Sinti. About 11 to 12,000 Roma and Sinti lived in Austria before the Holocaust, and about 1,500 survived. We can also talk about others who were targeted for violence. So between 600 and 900 LGBTQ Austrians were murdered, and others targeted by Nazi violence. There were about 537 political executions that took place at the Vienna Tribunal. And of course, a number of other people who were targeted in many different ways. And I should mention, in particular, when we're talking about LGBTQ history and the targeting of queer victims of the war, Austria was in this way even a little different from Germany. There were policies in place in Austria that made it illegal not only to be a homosexual man, but to be a homosexual woman, which means that under local policies, women who were queer were often targeted under LGBTQ extermination attempts in a way that they might not have been in Germany. This does not mean, by the way, that they were left alone in Germany, but they might have been classified, for example, as asocial or in other ways by the camps. In particular, in Austria, they were targeted for their queer identity. So getting a bit into the history, where does this victim myth come from? In Austria, although it had been classified as a belligerent nation during the war, right, working with Germany, the Allied powers were in fact the ones who were responsible for the birth of this first victim myth. In 1943, in the Moscow Declaration, Allied powers laid out their objectives for dismantling Hitler's regime in the case of a successful war campaign. And they officially labeled Austria as the first free country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression. This had many purposes. Some of it was to encourage, for example, domestic resistance, but it becomes incredibly key in the construction of Austria's new post-war government and the eventual independence post-war. However, what was left out of those later proceedings is the later qualifier that Austria has responsibility, which she cannot evade, for participation in the war at the site of Hitlerite Germany. Once the war is over, we're talking about post-war period, we're heading into the Cold War. Soviet Union and the Allied powers have greater concerns than enforcing denazification policies in the newly formed Austrian Republic, which in some ways was acting as a sort of neutral buffer zone between Western Europe and the East. So this sort of responsibility clause is never really reinforced by any of the other powers the way that it was in Germany. And this is important because quite often people will try and compare German and Austrian memorial practices, but we're talking about very, very different national contexts in the wake of the war and in the decades that followed. By the time that Austria received independence in 1955, the victim myth is so deeply ingrained that Austrian legislators felt justified in comparing the unjust Allied occupation with Hitler's annexation and referred to 17 years of a long and thorny road of bondage. Now, this is a lot of sort of background. Now we're finally going to get to the monuments, but these sort of understanding of the victim mythology and these narratives about how Austrians identified with and against National Socialism during this time period really helps set the scene for how we can understand the monuments that come afterwards. Now, finally, we are getting to those monuments. So the first monument, surprisingly enough, is not necessarily an Austrian monument, but a Russian one. The Heldendenkmal der Roten Armee was literally designed during the Russian army siege on Vienna. And in fact, there are some stories I found where the architects are behind enemy lines with like a piece of bread and a glass bottle modeling out what this monument is going to look like. After the Soviets retake Vienna, Vienna is divided into 4 zones. Anyone who has seen the film The Third Man with Orson Welles might be familiar with this setup. And the monument goes up, I want to say 3 months after the battle's end. The monument itself is not necessarily the most important thing here, but what it represents. It represents the threat of losing independence and being incorporated into the Soviet Union. And as a result, it's also the site of the proto-new government of the Austrian Republic, really emphasizing that the people of Austria spent, and the quote from the unveiling says, they spent 7 years languishing under Hitler's barbarity with no free expression of opinion and no confession of an idea was possible. People are forced into blind service. This is what the new government officials spoke about when they unveiled this monument from Russia. And this rhetoric foreshadows the direction of Austrian policy for all the decades to come. This monument still stands, by the way, and is very interesting. It was part of the treaty as the Soviet Union left Austria in 1955, that the monument must be maintained. The first Austrian monument, however, that comes pretty early on. And in the early years of the war, Vienna was initially emphasizing its victim status by celebrating those who resisted, which you might think makes sense. So this 1948 memorial to victims for Austrian freedom, it honors those, and I quote, who had fallen in battle against Nazi fascism for a free, independent Austria. Notice, by the way, the interesting dates on this monument. It's lumping 1934 to 1945. So not only is it Hitler's regime, but it's also the Austro-fascist regime prior to Hitler. However, we start off in 1948 during this occupation period by the other allies by recognizing those who resisted the army. But this memory pretty quickly shifts. Much of that resistance had in fact been organized by communists in Austria. And as the concerns of Austria are shifting from an anti-fascist to an anti-communist, commemoration and memorials also does that as well. So these kind of memorials begin to be dismissed as communist propaganda, and the focus of remembrance shifts pretty quickly to the commemoration of fallen Wehrmacht soldiers, in fact. And for the rest of the decade, you start to see many more memorials that look like this. This should look fairly familiar to those in our audience who live in the United States as well. A lot of us have town memorials to those who have fallen in major battles, and many countries around the world have their local community memorial to the soldiers who died in World War I and World War II. This takes place in the context during the late 40s and 50s of a pardoning of former army soldiers. So as this happens, we get another layer to this victim mythology, that of the pure Wehrmacht, the saubere Wehrmacht narrative. Basically, you get a narrative about soldiers who died in defense of home, of Heimat. And with, they were just doing their duty. They were forced into doing this war, but at the same time, protecting the lives of their loved ones in the community. So we see memorials like this, right, where we have 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945. I have a few more examples just to show here. We have, the First and Second Weltkrieg. And here, this one is interesting, right? It says, in memory of everyone in the community who had to give their lives in the world wars of 1914, you get the dates, those who had to give their lives, right? And according to scholar Heidemarie Uhl, memorials like this to resistance, they serve as symbols of consensual identity. Everyone in the community can remember those who are members of their community, the fathers, the sons, the brothers, the friends. Whereas memorials to resistance fighters and to victims of National Socialism, those are places of conflict. They don't feel good to relate to. You can't, in fact, relate to them. So despite the fact that we start to see during the 60s and 70s a global Holocaust consciousness rising, and this is taking place across the world in other nations, right? We have the Eichmann trial, we have the development of the word Holocaust, we have global memory shifts in all countries who were involved in World War II about the Holocaust. In Austria, we still see in the major monuments that are being built, most of these monuments are to those who were lost in the communities. And in fact, recognition of those who are specifically targeted victims because of the war, those are suppressed in favor of a community that's united in suffering. All of us suffered, and therefore nobody gets to be unique in their suffering. So nobody gets reparations, right? We're all victims here. We're all victims of Hitler. So you can't be a special victim. And that means that victimhoods such as those who are targeted for genocide, like the Roma and Sinti or like the Jewish community, are in fact being told that they cannot ask for reparations. It's inappropriate. Now, this is the context in which we move then into the 1980s. Now, worldwide, we've been seeing a shift in Holocaust memory. And I want to say that like the trends that we're talking about here in Austria are taking place in different forms in a lot of other nations. We can also track in some ways similar conversations going on even in the United States, and the way that we remember the war goes through shifts. But the 1980s sees a beginning of a new culture of commemoration in Austria as well, and several large-scale Viennese monuments in Austria. This particular monument is in Mörzienplatz. And Mörzienplatz is the site of a former Gestapo headquarters in Vienna. It's the first major Viennese monument to acknowledge Jews, really, and political prisoners as targeted victims of National Socialism. So not just everyone was victimized, but we have these specific groups. So you can see, of course, we've got the, Niemals vergessen, and we have the sign of a political prisoner here and the sign of a Jewish star. However, what's interesting is that while this is the first monument since the 1940s to honor Jews and political victims directly, the monument lays claim to these victims as, I quote, "our or Austria's dead, the immortal victims." But it fails to acknowledge that the vast majority of the Gestapo who had been staffing this site in Vienna were in fact Austrians as well. So while we're finally starting to have some conversations about the groups that particularly had been targeted, we're not necessarily having conversations in these public memorials about Austrian culpability. And it's within this context that in the next year, we're going to jump back to politics for a moment. Some of you may have heard of a man named Kurt Waldheim, and he first comes onto the political scene as the United Nations Secretary General in 1972. He's running for the presidency in Austria during the 1980s, and an Austrian journalist discovers that his World War II military record had been maybe not quite represented as they had thought before. He was not necessarily just someone who had been pressed into low-level service, as he had claimed, right? Sauber Wehrmacht, we just did our duty, we had no choice. He, in fact, had served a fairly significant position in the army and was present during war crimes in Yugoslavia and Greece. Despite all of this, you can see in this poster here, we Austrians, we vote for who we choose. Waldheim is elected in 1986, but this moment in politics, along with all of the shifts in memory going on in the 1980s, start really the big backlash against the victim mythology. They start to question it. And in this context, 2 years later, we have the Mahnmal gegen Krieg and Faschismus. And here, I want to take it some time to really dig through this monument with you. So we start with this monument. It's got a number of pieces. It's showing a pretty dramatic departure from the traditional victim narrative. It is the first Viennese monument to acknowledge the Holocaust as a distinct event, as well as the monument to implicate Austria in some of the perpetration of Nazi crimes. So you start with the gates of violence. And you can see that they show in many ways kind of a mixture of the horrors of concentration camps, skeletal figures, medical experiments. And in front of these gates, there is a plaque that informs the visitors that on this site in March 1945, an aerial bomb destroyed the Philipshof apartment house on this site, trapping and eventually killing several hundred civilians inside. This was actually an Allied bomb, I believe, from the Americans. So there's kind of extra weight and heft to this site. They walk through those gates, the gates of terror, and they come across this figure. And when I've showed this, so I mentioned I was a teacher, I showed this to students, a lot of them weren't quite sure what this was. Why is there barbed wire on the back? Who is this supposed to be? And who it's supposed to actually be is a Jewish rabbi. This figure is supposed to represent the 1938 November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht, where Jews were dragged from their homes after a night of breaking glass and vandalism and were forced to wash graffiti from the city streets. Visitors who are coming to this monument and observing the rabbi here find themselves literally as part of the tableau, taking on the role of those who are standing and watching. So it's very targeted, right? You can't literally visit this monument without taking part in this scene. Then we move through, we have at the end, there's some other pieces to this monument, but at the end we have the text of the new Austrian Republic. So you have this kind of arc in a way, right? From the Holocaust through the November pogrom, emerging from that into the new Austrian Republic. So in many ways, right, like I said, this is the first monument we see which is really addressing this participation in the Holocaust and the question of culpability, of responsibility. But there are some questions about this monument as well. So we come back to this image, and in fact, we find that the Jewish community had a lot of questions about this monument in Vienna. They said, you know, this is a fairly stereotypical image of Jews, and it's also one that the prostrate position feels undignified and humiliating. This isn't, you know, the first monument we have, which is really, really showcasing Jewish experience, and that this is the representation. And Hrdlička, the artist, responded in the moment that the monument was actually meant for the Viennese rather than for the Jews, and said that the Jews, and I quote, should learn from the Christians about finding strength and humility. He stated that Christ died the most humiliating death of all, and it became iconography for half the world. And if the Jews complain that I use an act of humiliation as a symbol, it's their problem. This monument is taking place within the context of the Waldheim affair and the aftermath. But it's still part of this progressive memory. Now, politically, we also go through a big shift here, right? So this is 1988, 1991, the Austrian government officially starts to claim responsibility. We see in fact, 1991, in a speech in Israel, the Vice Chancellor Vrnitsky makes a speech saying basically this much. We start to see shifts in talking about funds for victims, reparations, and a fairly rapid collapse of this victim narrative. Now, this is not to say, as many other scholars have pointed out this week, that this victim narrative disappeared or that it's not still present today. But in terms of official representation, that very sort of stark narrative of we were all victims and therefore bear no responsibility, I think many people consider it at this point pretty dead. And within that context, in many ways, in response to the previous memorial, we have the Nameless Library, which is built, and here we have finally one of our women, a female architect named Rachel White-Reed. Now, this monument lives in Judenplatz in Vienna. It is a bulky room-shaped sculpture, and it shows an inverted library cast entirely in concrete. So as we look more closely at these, we can see that these are in fact inverted books. You can't see the spines, you can't see the titles. It represents in some ways the idea of the void that's left behind in the wake of the Holocaust, the loss in knowledge, the loss in names, the loss of stories that we might not even know exist anymore, right? There are all of these things, we cannot access it. The library is closed, you can't get in, there's no door here. It is also the first monument in the Viennese landscape that recognizes the Jewish Holocaust as distinct and unique from a general Austrian experience of victimhood. So even the last memorial, by being built on a site of an Allied bombing and recognizing as well as part of this whole memory, victims of the war there in Vienna, you know, in one way, it brings all of those victimhoods in conversation with each other. But in another way, it's also saying we have Holocaust victims and we have victims of this bombing. They're all still being remembered in the same space. So this one is saying this is different. We're only remembering Jewish victims of the Holocaust. What's interesting as well is that this is the site of the old medieval temple in Austria and of the pogrom that took place there. And in fact, we have this remnant of the medieval period where you see the language talking about the destruction of the temple and the murder of the Jews. And in fact, underneath this site, they ended up discovering parts of the old temple. So there's a museum now where you can go underneath this site and visit the temple. And that in itself could be its own talk, right? Thinking about how do we navigate layers of different moments of trauma in Austrian history, but also maybe not have a timeline where the entire history of Jews in Austria is that of trauma. So there's a kind of how do you bring memory into conversation with each other without conflating them? And now we're moving along. That one was from 2000. We're into the moment, which is really kind of after those monuments. And we start to see a lot of monuments that are looking at more discrete elements of Austrian memory. So one of those is the Mahnmal für die Morde, the murdered children of Spiegelgrund at Am Steinhof. This was unveiled as part of a memorial exhibition, and it coincided with the burial of the remains of nearly 800 children who were murdered at the infamous Spiegelgrund Hospital Clinic. The hospital there was responsible during the war for over 7,500 patients being murdered in connection with Nazi medical eugenics policies. In addition to forced sterilizations, medical torture, deportations, and murder of the adult population, the hospital housed one of the largest killing centers of the Nazi child euthanasia program. At least 789 children were murdered, and their brains, spinal cords, and organs were removed and preserved for scientific study. What's difficult as well beyond that is to know that these remains were used in medical research for decades after the war. At least until the 1980s and possibly as late as 1998. There is a long history of Heinrich Gross, who is one of the doctors who was in charge of this. He was eventually attempted to be brought to trial around this time period, and that whole process brings this memory to prominence. He ends up dying before he can actually go to trial. But this story highlights just how long it's taking to really be willing to engage in these different histories of crimes here, right? This is taking place in 2002, 2003. In 1995, just a few years before that, the Austrian state finally recognized victims of Nazi eugenics by including them in the new National Fund for Victims of National Socialism. And the Sorgesetz, the regulation of public relief for victims, was amended to include them in 2005. So this is something that's still kind of very recent and present. How am I doing on time, by the way? I want to look at this. All right, we've got a little bit more time. So I want to move now and kind of do some brief touches on some of the other monuments that have taken place more recently. So we have, you can see here, there's candles for the children. And this is actually a little interesting tie over with Matthias and his presentation of the Zentralfriedhof. There is the burial of the children's remains took place there. In 2006, the Stolpersteinen, or the stumbling stones, come to Austria. You may have seen them in other parts of Europe. They are stones that are put in place where at the last site of choice where a Jewish person or a victim of the Holocaust lived before the war. And what's interesting about this type of memorial is it really, instead of being a site where it's like a built structure, you've got something that has a layover over the entire city, right? You walk through, you're looking at these different living spaces and you see where somebody used to live. And so you're not just seeing sort of in one site in the city, but all across the city, these places where loss took place, where things are missing, where people are missing who you no longer see anymore. And in a very similar way, this next monument works the same way. So this is what I find one of the most interesting monuments that I got to study, and it's called the Keys Against Forgetting. In 1999, a woman named Barbara Kinter was visited in her district, Leopoldstadt, close to the center of the Vienna city, and a surviving Jewish cousin came to visit and was really dismayed by the lack of visible traces of his former community in her district. He said, you don't see anything of its Jewish past. You don't see that we ever lived here. After his visit, Barbara Kinter was inspired and researched the Jewish community of her town and the history of her husband's family, and ends up finding out that her own home in the district of Alsergrund had actually once housed the second highest population of Viennese Jews in the city prior to 1938. In partnership with other residents of her building, as well as several historians they contact, she ends up piecing together the histories of the previous inhabitants of her own home, her own building. And the group that she brought together sought to track down the fate of each of the former Jewish inhabitants and to get in touch with any survivors or relations. The goal was to erect a plaque in front of their building in remembrance of those who used to live there. Now, this might have been a small scale project. Oh, and this is, here we go. This is the street, Savigengasse, where they lived. But one factor comes into play, and that is that the owner of the building she lived in was the descendant of one of the Nazis who ended up acquiring the home during this period. And while Kinter doesn't believe that this daughter herself is a Nazi by any means, it's tied up with these memories of family and of her father. And so she refused to have a plaque put on the front of the house. So it might have been a small scale project, but this spurred the group onward. And instead they put a plaque 6 inches in front of the house. And so, but at this point, the pushback that they encountered and this whole process they've been going through, getting permission from the city to have it in front of the house, their surprise at the challenge from the house owner really spurred them to make this a community-wide project. And it goes from there. So they bring together historians, they start doing tours of the site, they reach out to former residents, and they invite local students at one of the art universities to submit designs for a local memorial. The winner was one called Keys Against Forgetting from 27-year-old Julia Schultz, and it's a glass vitrine that's been set into the pavement containing 462 antique keys, each labeled with one of the Jewish residents who had been driven from their homes. According to Barbara Kintert, Schultz thought of this as a way of kind of symbolic restitution on the part of the community. You know, how can you give someone their home back? They had their keys taken away and I wanted to return the keys to them. The names are important as well, right? You know, we think about the Holocaust as this moment of erasure, all of the names that have been lost, the goal of Nazis to eradicate the Jewish community here. So by having these very specific names of the victims, they can be remembered, visited by members of their family. This was very important to the residents of the community. They say it's often the case that when descendants visit, they search for the name, right? There's a process here. Another team member states that she wanted the memorial to make sure it wasn't too abstract, but was rooted in the very concrete history of this community. This is something really interesting, right? It's a very, very concrete moment of one street in one town in one city. But in that way, it becomes almost a way of remembering all of the other streets and the other communities that were very local and very specific. And so it does in a way evoke almost the every person, even though it's about these very, very specific people in a very specific town. It's also interesting that it doesn't just include those who were killed during National Socialism, but also those who were forced to leave their homes. And by incorporating all variations of the missing in this memorialization, this monument commemorates not only the loss of 462 individuals, but the loss of a community, that this community is no longer there and is no longer the way that it might have been if they had stayed. A few more that we'll pop through really quickly. Right after I left in 2015, they erected the Deserters-Denkmal. This was a monument that really pushed back against this kind of narrative of the saubere Wehrmacht, the pure soldier, by pointing out that deserting was an option. For many years, desertion was seen as sort of, you were a traitor and you carried a stigma that being in the Wehrmacht might not have carried. You also had a criminal record up until, I believe, 2009, until when that was finally erased. So this monument, it lives outside of the federal chancellery in the president's office, right in the center of the city. And it evokes the idea of, you know, this poem, All Alone on an X. So you've got this sense of intense isolation and the act of desertion, both during and after World War II, the experience of deserters in the wake of the war. And again, it's kind of very interesting to think about in this landscape, which for so long was occupied by kind of the honorable soldier, the heroic soldier. We have something which almost feels the opposite, but is still heroic in its own way. I ended up participating in another memorial led by Karen Frostig, who is an American, but whose father escaped from Vienna when he was a child, where they sprayed graffiti around 38 different sites of memory around the city, particularly ones associated with different victim groups. So the idea of having a memorial that names, but also differentiates the experience of different groups. So Roma and Sinti and Jewish and Jehovah's Witness and Catholic. So here you can see me, I was giving tours of some of the sites of memory. And it also culminated in a naming memorial where all of the names were projected on the side of one of the buildings in the center of Vienna. We have a few others. There is memorialization attempts that have happened for the queer community in Vienna. Nothing's kind of quite come to fruition, although in the last year and a half, they have had approval and there is a monument that is underway. So that's something that's in progress. In 2013, they started a festival, which is a different kind of memorial taking place in Heldenplatz. And it basically takes place on the anniversary of the end of the war, where for many years, current National Socialists would march through this area. And so this was a way to reclaim the space by celebrating the end of National Socialism and rejecting that ideology. let's see, I think we end it there. I will also mention that I know that there's currently in 2020, the construction of a Shoah Wall of Names memorial in Vienna is also underway, and I'll be interested to see how that progresses. So I'm sure at this point that I'm over time, but I hope that this has given a sense of the progression through time and just how complex it is to try and figure out how do you grapple with these memorials in public spaces? How do we represent different groups, different ideas? How do those shift over time? Who are the monuments aimed at and memorializing? And what does memory look like as we go forward from here? And I see some wonderful comments and questions in here, which I will be very happy to address after Matthias's presentation.
Thank you, Kate.
Hello and thanks everybody. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. Thanks to be part of this wonderful webinar so far tonight. Thanks for the introduction earlier, Tali. And I'm hoping that I can be a short addition, but hopefully sweet addition to this seminar today. So I'm going to talk about the Zentralfriedhof or Central Cemetery in Kaiser Ebersdorf, Simmering, Vienna. So Simmering is in one of the outskirts of Vienna here. As you can see, the city center of Vienna is right here and the Central Cemetery is right here. So it's fairly big and it looks like a pentagon, and the Central Cemetery was established in 1874 as one of the first interconfessional cemeteries in Vienna. And today it's one of the biggest in Europe. But why am I talking about the Central Cemetery in the first place? So in general, cemeteries are places of memory, and the topic of today is the Holocaust remembered. So I thought the cemetery is definitely a good addition to that. And learning about the Central Cemetery shows us how the Viennese Jewish life of the early 1900s is dealt with today and commemorated today, and how Austria deals with its difficult duty to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. And that's the reason why I'll be taking a closer look on a few commemoration sites that can be found on the grounds of the Central Cemetery. And I will also draw a few connections to the topics discussed in the earlier webinars of this series, Women's Agency During the Holocaust. Another question I want to answer before everything, why am I, a young Austrian guy, most of you probably don't know, is talking about the Central Cemetery. And the reason for that is very simple. As Tali already mentioned, I grew up in Vienna and actually pretty close to the cemetery. And right around here, this yellow line I drew, that's my way to school every day. So you can see a big part of my life happened right next to the Central Cemetery. And that's the reason why I was really fascinated by this topic and enjoyed researching, and really glad, and I'm really glad that I can present this to you right now. All right, I am now talking about the Jewish sections here at the Central Cemetery. So the first Jewish section was opened officially in 1879. And already back then it got severe anti-Semitic backlash because people just did not want to have a Jewish cemetery right next to the other cemeteries. Not long after, this section got too small, so another piece of land had to be bought at the 5th gate. Right now, or today, it's the 4th gate. These two Jewish sections both had their own ceremony halls, where are now called the Old Jewish section and the New Jewish section. And a selection of a few prominent Jews buried here on the central cemeteries are Friedrich Thorberg, Arthur Schnitzler, Viktor Frankl, or Otto Seuker. As mentioned, I want to talk about a few memorial sites here on the central cemetery. And for this reason, I wanted to discuss with you the rebuilt ceremony hall at the now fourth gate of the central cemetery. And this is located right, I have this here, here the cemetery, the ceremony hall. All right, this is the ceremony hall from the outside. And on a side note, I spent hours and hours waiting for the bus, waiting for the tram line right here, 50 meters from here. So I know this area pretty well. But why am I talking about the ceremony hall here? I can't see any commemoration sites. And let's go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, I forgot to show you a few pictures of the Jewish sections at the central cemetery. And this is an entrance to the old Jewish section, a gate I as well drove past every day or most days of my life. Here you can see the gravesite of Arthur Schnitzler on the right, and right next to it on the left is the one of Friedrich Thorberg. On the left, you can see destroyed graves. During the Reichspogromnacht in 1938, the ceremony halls and the cemeteries were vandalized. And during World War II, the central cemetery was bombed. So on the right, you can see the picture where the ceremony hall of the old Jewish section once stood. Today, there's just a plain field of grass. As mentioned earlier, let's go back to the ceremony hall. And I want to talk about a memorial plaque that's right at the entrance of the ceremony hall. And what's interesting about this particular plaque is the color for me. You can see it, you can clearly see the blue color that's made of, those are the copper stones that were used here, and the olive wood. On the text, it says, niemals vergessen, never forget, and then a number of ghettos, concentration camps, and killing centers. But as I said, I'm pretty short on time, so I'm gonna jump right next to the next site. And this is still at the ceremony hall, but inside. And those are 4 different glass windows created by artist and Auschwitz survivor Heinrich Sussmann. Each glass window tells a different story, and they are displayed at every wall of the ceremony hall inside. These stories are destruction of the temples, Theresienstadt, death camps, and the 4th one is angels carry the menorah to the glory. I decided to show 2 of you to you now. As you can see here, here's the one of death camp with the fire. Unfortunately, the picture isn't of best quality. And the next picture is of the story, Angels Carry the Menorah to the Glory. All right, let's jump to the next commemoration site. And for that, I'm gonna go back to Google Earth and fly all the way here. So what is this? A special memorial site can be found in Group 40, or Grouperfields, a section of the central cemetery, where a monument for commemoration has been built in 2013, so pretty late. In Viennese, this commemoration place was built for Viennese resistance fighters and also female resistance fighters who were beheaded in Vienna's provincial court and were buried here in the Grouperfields of the central cemetery between 1942 and 1945. As you can see, I'm drawing back the line to the earlier webinars for resistance. So I want you to have a look. And on the group 40, there's a lot more going on, a lot more happening. I could talk about hours and hours about the inscripts here or about this plug. There's just so much to cover. And as I said, I'm short on time, but yeah, I hope you can forgive me, maybe another time. What's interesting about the group 40, it not only serves as a commemoration site. And what I was amazed by, that right next to it, about here, is the gravesite of Hans Hölzel, who you probably better know as the famous artist Falco. And another one single person I want to specifically talk about here of the group who was buried here or found her last piece here at group 40 is Schwester Restituta, Sister Restituta, or her name Maria Kafka. As you can see, here is a list of female resistance fighters who were buried at group 40. And here is Maria Kafka. And the reason why I found Maria Kafka so interesting is because she was one of the loudest voices of resistance in the Catholic Church and was actually beatified in Vienna in 1998 as the first martyr of the Archdiocese of Vienna. All right, let's continue. And we are jumping to a place we've already been today, and that's the memorial of the victims of fascism that Kate already mentioned only shortly, but we've been there already. So if you attended earlier webinars of the series we are in right now, you may be familiar with the name Hannah Berger already. But why am I mentioning Hannah Berger today or now? And the reason for that, this sculpture here, which is also on my PowerPoint, it's a statue. It's called the Accusing One. And this sculpture is actually, was created by the model of Hannah Berger. So Hannah Berger stood model for this sculpture here. And it amazed me during my research how everything is connected. And now I want to also show you something else from a previous webinar. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, but right here is the gravesite of Hedy Lamarr, which we also talked about in one of the earlier webinars. And I want to show you her gravesite real quick. That's what it looks like. And I was wondering about these metal rods, and they somehow look like bubbles, what it's representing. I'm sure there is a lot of information. I just did not have the time to dig more into it. But to conclude my part of this presentation, I want to talk about the Central Cemetery today. What's its reception? What's its standing today? And as a Viennese man, I may have a more personal insight into that. So the Central Cemetery today is used for leisure purposes, like taking a walk, like running, walking your dog there, and I am as well doing that. Because I'm living so close by, my dog loves going there, and he loves having he loves taking long walks. Which dog doesn't? So a lot of fellow Simmeringer, as we call ourselves, living in Simmering, do that. And the Central Cemetery also became part of Viennese culture. example, or I give you an example for that. One way to say he died in the Viennese slang, you could say, is hat den 71er genommen, which means he took the 71 tram line. And the tram line is the tram line that is going right next to the central cemetery. And the reason for that is that back when transportation of the dead was still a little bit of a problem, there were transportation wagons on the tram line. So that's why people today in Austria sometimes say, instead of he died, they say he took the 71 tram line. And that's it. That's me for today. I hope I could give you a more personal insight and that you enjoyed my little participation here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And thank you very much, Kate. And we have a few minutes and very interesting comments. And it was really so interesting to hear from you, Kate, after a year in Vienna, studying it from a historian side, from a memorial side, and Matthias, to hear from you, a young man, 19 years old, that grew up right there, as you said, was taking the bus and seeing the cemetery all the time. So, Kate, perhaps we will start with you, and there are many comments, first of all, of people that are remembering their families. So, for example, Hedy Davis and Margaret Urban, their parents, their mothers came from Vienna, and they have that connection to the past, which was really quite touching. But maybe let's start with Stephen Laufer's question about the narrative on the Soviet monument in Vienna, which you started with, the 1945 one, whether one has any sympathy with the Red Army or not, and whether the political intent post-war, it is a memorial to those killed liberating Vienna from the Nazis. They defeated the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, in the Battle of Vienna at the cost of over 38,000 dead and almost 130,000 wounded. Very heavy fighting. And perhaps I would like to add, Kate, and ask you, in Germany, many memorials are coming along, in Berlin. So you have one for euthanasia now, for the Roma, and so on. And one for the Soviets will come. It will come. We know that. What are your thoughts about the same in Vienna or Austria?
So first of all, I wanted to say thank you. I think that is such an excellent point. And I think this is one of the places where monuments are so interesting because they serve so many purposes, right? That this monument absolutely remembers the dead from that battle and their losses, and it's important. And the monument at the same time can also be a political moment, as it was in many other places where very similar monuments were actually built. This is part of a trend that took place throughout the Soviet Union. But that shouldn't, and I appreciate the point, that doesn't diminish the fact that it's remembering real people who experienced real deaths and real trauma and the service there. And I think that what we actually see when you do this sort of study in other areas of occupation throughout the Soviet Union that are also grappling with Holocaust histories, is you have a lot of intersections of different layers of history and quite often layers of trauma. And so the question of how do you parse out who to remember where and who are we prioritizing at which time? How do you deal with people who maybe suffered during the Holocaust and people who suffered during the Cold War in different ways and maybe were perpetrators in one point and victims in another? That so many of these histories are really, really complicated. And which becomes even more difficult when you're trying to distill it down to a single monument. I think another great example of that actually is the Monument Against War and Fascism, where it very successfully evokes certain questions and certain conversations in the community. But as somebody pointed out, there are some moments of insensitivity as well. And there are all of these layers when we talk about kind of what role does a monument play in a community. But I really appreciate that point, and I think it's a great reminder that it doesn't just stand as a political moment. There are other aspects to it as well.
Great. Matthias, a question for you. Did you study about the subject at school? Did other friends at school were interested in the cemetery and in the memorials? And how did you become interested in the Jewish part of the cemetery?
So talking about commemoration is not something that schools are very much concerned about, like they are about learning basic facts about the World War and Nazism and fascism. I remember though that early on, back in primary school, that we had a day trip to the old Jewish cemetery. And I really was fascinated by it, because it really is a place of so much, it is a place rich of history, and you can really feel it. About the old Jewish section, there are there's a lot of greenery, and the plants are all sometimes, and you can sometimes even spot a deer hopping around. So going there back in primary school was definitely one of the reasons why I am fascinated by this topic today. But to come back to your question a little bit, if we learned about the central cemetery a lot in school, not really. So as I said, school tries to cover the basics, and the central cemetery is definitely not one of them. Yeah.
And that's interesting because it's next door to the school, and it just shows you how we sometimes ignore what is right next to us. Kate, Bev Price is asking regarding the makers of the monuments, who is making the comment on a shift in Austrian responsibility. And she's saying Rachel Whitered is a Brit. How was she recruited to make the artistic comment? I'm asking about the subjectivity of Austrians making their own comments about themselves in the collective shift towards taking responsibility for perpetration, rather than outside artists being recruited or commissioned to make the comment.
Thank you for what a brilliant question. And it's one where I have to say, I want to read more, having read your question, because I actually don't know very much about the process of her recruitment. A lot of my research was focusing much more on the monuments that came after hers. I think it is this excellent question that shows up in other countries as well, right? Where the artist themselves is recruited from. I mean, there was this very interesting conversation going on with the new LGBTQ memorial coming from also another British designer, which recently has been canceled, and they're looking for a replacement. There's more to that. And I think what I can say, while I don't know the specific intent behind that, I will say one of the things that I think interests me the most about some of the monuments towards the end of this presentation, particularly the one on Savitengasse, is the way that it was so hyper-localized and was a community, that this was actually, they ended up gaining community funding, where there's funding available for different districts for betterment, and it can be everything from parks or community activities, or in this case, memorials and research. And it was something that came together on a very local level. And so you're making me want to work on a paper where I would compare sort of that sort of narrative as opposed to what's taking place when choices are made for the national level of narrative. Because you're right, we see several of the monuments in this, Hrdlička is Czech. I believe that the artist for the Deserteursdenkmal is Scottish, possibly, although don't quote me on that, I have to check. So there's really an interesting conversation to be had about who is designing the selections for these national memorials.
Yeah, and Carolyn is actually adding in who is speaking, the artist or the community. And I think that is another layer of the same.
As well, yes.
Yeah.
One of the most moving, and I missed that there, but there, I could talk for an hour about Servietengasse. One of the things that struck me, Kintert talked about when they were pulling together those keys, that they would invite people to donate them. And so they would have women or men just walking in off the street with a bag of keys that they had at home that they weren't using anymore from their own homes. And just the process of coming together, it was really unlike many of the other memorials I'd seen before, and was really beautiful.
Few other questions, both Kate and Matthias. I know you never have had enough time to cover all the memorials. Both of you said that. And there are a few people that are mentioning other memorials, other streets, a synagogue Hedy Davis is speaking about, other histories like Jugendplatz, Middle Ages history of anti-Semitism, other histories that are not mentioned. So maybe general comments from both of you about some of those memorials that you just simply did not have time to cover, and maybe final thoughts about those memorials.
Absolutely. Well, before I jump in, Matthias, do you want to say anything, or do you have any memorials that we didn't get to say?
I mostly covered the Central Cemetery, and even there, on the grounds of the cemetery, there are so many different memorial sites, like the one you mentioned earlier of the Children's Memorial, something I did not cover today. But there are so many, like the ones about Jewish soldiers during World War I as well. It's a lot. It's definitely a lot, and it was very hard to pick out the best of what I will use in my presentation today. But anyone who's interested, there are ways of diving into this topic more and more. And yeah, it's just very, it was just a short dip into the pool of every memorial site in Vienna. Yeah.
I will say the same. I'm actually thrilled that the people in the chat are mentioning a few monuments where I had not been familiar with them before. I'm so, there are so many. When you expand this conversation to take in every plaque, to talk about street names, to talk about names of buildings and institutions, to talk about homes or things inside places of worship, there are. When you look around for memory in a community, I think we start to see it more and more in ways that, as Matthias and Tali both mentioned, that it can be easy to pass over in some ways. And I think what I really find interesting is the conversation that then goes to say, how do all of these work together as a landscape? And what kind of conversations are they starting in the community? Kind of who is the audience? Who is reading them? What purpose do they serve? And so I hope, if nothing else, that if people are enjoying this, or as actually as Albert is bringing up too, I didn't even have time to mention that the barbed wire was laid down in the Herrlichke Memorial to prevent people from sitting on it. But you can also ask, what does it mean to have somebody interact with a monument? Is there a proper way? Is there a way to keep people from passing by? Is any way a good way? Not that there's a right answer to any of these things, but I hope that if nothing else, people take a look at the memorials that are in your own community and think about how they work there. And I think for me, I know that once I started looking for them, I kept finding them, and each one adds more to the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are really running out of time because we promised you an hour, and we're continuing. But if you will allow us just a few more minutes, I agree, Albert Lichtblau, who took me personally on an amazing tour of Salzburg, but your comment is very, very true. And Heather Blumenthal is adding, the comment of those places that people are using for recreation. I'm thinking about Plaszow, the site of the concentration camp near Krakow, where people are running with the dogs. Any thoughts for you and Matthias about that? Using cemeteries, using memorial sites, like the one in Berlin for posing for pictures, the statue of the Jew in Vienna that people were sitting on and standing on. Can you comment perhaps on that before we go to your final thoughts?
Absolutely. This is a tough one because I know that I have certain things I would probably choose not to do in some of these sites. But I also, maybe I'll speak first to the cemetery in general. And I'll say that I think that there are different norms that we have in different cultures and at different times about interactions with the dead. And that there's not one right way to respect them. That's not to say that as a community, we can't say in this space, we ask that people do not do this because this is how we feel about it. But I don't think that I'm someone where I would want to say across the board, it's never, some people are going to say, we want folks to spend time in these spaces to enjoy them because they'll remember. Other places, it's part of a celebration. And yet in others, we say this is a solemn place and that this is not respectful to people who need that space to be solemn. So I think that it's a deeper conversation to have. And in the same way, in some ways, I'd say the same about memorials where, I don't think I would I think I would find it quite frustrating, some of the treatment we see, but I also want to leave space for there to be a conversation about what does it mean to interact with these spaces. So I don't think I want to be prescriptive, if that makes sense, that we say, what does this mean in our space? What does it mean to have a picnic in front of one of these buildings? What does it mean to go and really engage with it? What's appropriate and what's not? And while I personally have some feelings about things that I would maybe find inappropriate, I think it's worth talking about.
I don't know, Matthias, if you want to reflect on that as a young person living in that area.
Yeah, I'm like Kate mentioned, it's a bigger conversation to have. I think I think what's really important is the intention behind it, or the intention behind doing, of course, like running in the central cemetery, for example. I don't know if I would be running in the central cemetery because I also saw the question on the chat. There are definitely there are lots of parks in Vienna, so there's no shortage of parks. So why do it in the cemetery? But it's hard to answer. It's definitely a bigger conversation to have, but I don't believe there's a wrong or right answer because different cultures approach differently to their dead. Yeah.
If I might chime in again, I think maybe what I would leave it with is consider how other people are using the space and what they may need of the space and try to be considerate and to be aware if you're in one of those spaces. That might be where I started.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe final answer, a question, because I think people will be really interested. Any thoughts of the presence of Jews today in Vienna, in Austria? And I'm not sure, Kate, from your experience in the city, and Matthias, really will be quite interesting to think about the Jewish community today in Vienna.
I'll go first. So this is again something where I would want to be, so there is a Jewish community today in Vienna for sure, and in Austria in general. As a Jewish woman, actually, when I lived in Austria over 3 years, I was able to, attend synagogue or find holidays to join with other people. It's nowhere near the size that it was prior to World War II. It is still very small. And I think in terms of what the shape of that community looks like, the role in the city, the growth, that would be something where I would want to turn to Jewish Austrians who live there. But I think you can, the community is not recovered in the way that it was prior to the war. But there is a thriving community.
Thanks. Matthias, would you know at all? I think I lost you. Is Matthias dropped? I know. No, here you are. Matthias, do you know about the
Sorry,
community?
I got kicked out.
Yes, sorry.
My internet's very bad at the moment.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Do you want to try? Do you want to try to say something?
It works now. Sorry for the internet. We're in luck that it did not happen before. If I remember your question correctly, how Jewish life today is in Vienna, or how I experienced it. Honestly saying, I did not encounter many Jews during my life in Vienna. Not many, not at all. I went to a school in Simmering as well, and I do not know of any single Jewish classmate in my school. So occasionally you see someone wearing a kippah on the street, but personally, I don't have lots of stories to tell.
It's really interesting, and there are some books that came out after about the Jewish community lately. Betsy Anthony's book came about the returning. Did the Jewish community return? So it is fascinating a subject, but time did run away from us. So it is my honor and my pleasure to say thank you to you, Kate Melchior, for sharing with us your research and really, we all feel now like going to Vienna and visiting all those memorials that you told us about. And thank you, Matthias, for taking us to your neighborhood and exploring some of those memories and images that you saw growing up. It was really fascinating. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to the Austrian Embassy and to the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, and to all of you for being part of the series. Please do join us in our next webinars. Actually, we have a film screening tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, the film Santa Rosa. It's a delightful, delightful film about refugees that, Polish refugees that found shelter in Mexico in the Santa Rosa farm. It's such a delightful film. And if not, we will see you soon. And to all our Jewish friends, we are wishing you Happy New Year, Shana Tova, and all the very, very best, health and happiness. Good night.